I am still very much, and perhaps I'm biased, but I'm still very much a proponent of the fact that young people need to get involved in politics, in political organizing, political contestation, political party involvement, whichever party you choose.
Yeah.
Whether it's Rise Mzansi or any other, I don't mind, but
Welcome back to Born Free, and to everyone, happy Youth Month. We're going to be having a lot of conversations. We're going to be here as the youth, talking to the world, talking to South Africa. Otsile Nkadimeng, how are you doing today, my brother?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing well. And today we have the honor of being graced by the MEC Vuyiswa Ramokgopa. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you, Khumo.
Thank you very much. There's a lot happening in South Africa. There's a lot happening internationally. But I particularly want to start with Youth Month in particular, particularly where the youth has been. And also, I want to ask a question around how Rise Mzansi approached the youth. Because what we heard very strongly within that 2024 election was the youth was important. The youth ought to be prioritized. And of course, the polling data shows that they didn't necessarily turn up to the polls. But particularly from your standpoint, how do you view the youth in terms of their political engagement? What's Rise Mzansi's view on where the youth can play in politics and in the discourse that's currently happening? But also, what do you expect of the youth now that you are in politics and now that you are in office?
That's a combo question. But let me start perhaps on a lighter note. You introduced me in the beginning by saying you're here with the MEC. That is true. I'm also the national chairperson of Rise Mzansi. And I'm in fact the youngest MEC in Gauteng. So in honor of Youth Month, I am very happy to be here right now and to be kickstarting this great Youth Month with you guys.
Most definitely.
Now coming back to your question, and it's a really important question, and I want to start here by saying, youth and the youth are not homogenous.
Yes.
And I think that needs to be the starting point of the conversation, because when we assess the youth as a voting bloc, you cannot divorce that from the socioeconomic stratification that we see in every other aspect and every other demographic of society. So you've got the youth as in the what they refer to as NEET youth, not in employment, education, and training. And a lot of these young people, for example, are affected not just by issues of, I can't find the right party to vote for, but actually one of the biggest contributing factors to a lot of those young people is that many of them do not have ID documents to begin with. And actually a lack of ID documents is the first original sin, for lack of a better word, because without an ID, you can't register to vote. And without being registered to vote, you obviously cannot vote. So there's a nuance in looking at the data that one needs to be able to analyze. And then, of course, you look at youth who are university-based youth. And now the university environment, of course, creates in itself a microcosm of political activity. And one might even argue a militance, that emerges out of the university environment. And that has an effect. I remember myself, not too long ago being in varsity, and the kind of ideas, the radicalism, the type of change I wanted to see, what appealed to me ideologically at the time, is very different from who I am now, 20 years later, mother of 3 children, taxpayer, mortgage payer. I have very different priorities. And so that would affect, obviously, my voting decisions, but also, what I understand as the options that are available.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of things, that impact young people and why they vote. But I think one of the bigger issues, and I think this is where we spent a lot of time as Rise Mzansi, was in really speaking to what we would call the culture of politics and the political culture in South Africa, and the ways in which that is very alienating for a lot of people, not just youth, but also youth. I suppose young people are a lot more critical because they're not burdened by historical loyalties and past affiliations and whatever. And in fact, I think young people are a lot more clear about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable politically. So that's something that we had to say, what is the type of political culture that needs to exist that is more inclusive, or that can be more inclusive for young people? What does this generation respond to? And it wasn't like kind of sitting and trying to have a marketing strategy. We ourselves, you know, as I'd say I'm like an early millennial. There's a type of politics that doesn't resonate with me, but there's a type of politics that I also perhaps want to see and I'm hungry for.
Yeah.
I want to see myself represented in my leaders. I want them to talk about the issues that matter to me, that I'm dealing with on a daily basis. And of course, there is just the question of representation. I mean, if everybody that you see who is successful and relevant in politics is like over the age of 60 or 70, what does that say to you, you know, as a young person?
Yeah.
Or as a youngish person? They call us youth endala. So I'll put myself in that category. And I think that plays a part, but it isn't just about representation. I think it's not just about physical representation, but it's about representation of the issues and the perspective that young people have.
Yeah.
And I still think there's a lot of work to be done there, you know. It doesn't, quite frankly, it probably doesn't matter what the ID document of the person in parliament says. What matters is, are they saying the things, talking about the things, tabling the things that are impacting young people, you know, every single day, without talking at young people, but really being able to reflect the voice of young people in a way that is authentic, that is grounded in actual like research and groundwork, not just like, oh, I once, you know, watched a program about young people and I heard that. No, you have to actually do the work of organizing young people, organizing with young people to understand what the issues are, so that you can do the work of being a representative for them. And the last thing I want to say, which is very important, is that not every young person who is in parliament is representing young people. And I think that's a mistake we often make. And it's same with women. There are many women who are not there representing the agenda of undoing structures of patriarchy. They are not there to progress, you know, women and advance the agenda of women. And similarly, there are young people who are maybe the right age, they may be the right demographic, but we need to be a lot more circumspect in saying, do they really speak for us?
Yeah.
Or are they just there to be there to actually prop up the system and participate in a system that fails us and continues to fail us?
Yeah.
So I think that for me becomes the next layer of the conversation, to say, young people, what is your agenda? And then how are you collectively also organizing amongst yourselves to make sure that your agenda is platformed front and center in these conversations and places where decisions are being made?
Yeah. Being part of the legislative process must be a very interesting thing, because I think what you speak to is also like this misidentification in South Africa of assigning identity to people that look like us. And I think my question becomes, with that being the case, firstly, one, who are the people that young people should be looking to, or what are the identification points? Because I guess in some instances, there would be the concern that either people are too old, like you've mentioned, where we would then say people are in their 60s and 70s unable to relate to those issues. Or secondly, we have to then assume that the young people are in office are the ones that are necessarily going to speak to us. And so that puts a weird demographic in terms of how we look at parliament, because it tends to be filled with these two demographics, people that look like us or people that are really old, which then leaves young people with a sense of apathy, right? And I think the South African election showed that, with only 54% actually coming to the polls. And with great recognition actually to the ID thing. I actually didn't think about that. So that's a completely different issue. But particularly then to what's happening in terms of young people getting their voice to places that matter, getting their voices to places where there's legislative processes that are going to take place. Who necessarily should they be speaking to? Because I think the budget in many instances reflects a lot of that. UCT organized a protest on the day of the budget. Well, Budget 1.0, we've been through 3 of these. But yeah, they organized a protest and said, we want to go to the union buildings to ensure that we get free education and the issues surrounding NSFAS. And that, for me, was a defining moment, because that was not only a denial of the budget that exists currently, but also young people saying that they want to see a certain action taken, they want to see a certain legislative process being taken place. within that, there still is the question of who then are they meant to be speaking to, and who should they be going to, because we're not necessarily there for all of the conversations. And I think this year has exposed how much little we know about Parliament and the processes that go into it. So from your standpoint and what you've been viewing and what you've been engaging, who particularly and where particularly should we be going to have those conversations?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, as a starting point, and it's picking up from the previous point that I was making, is that it's not so much about who you vote for. It should be more about what you vote for. And the what can be carried actually by a lot of different voices.
Yeah.
I think we become too concerned with the personality-based politics, the individualizing of political ideas, which is not, it shouldn't be that way. Young people, no matter which strata of society they find themselves in, have concerns, one, that are in many ways very reflective of just the broader issues of society, but they also have very unique issues. Unemployment, for example, is one of those issues that affects young people disproportionately. One may argue even that immigration or irregular migration affects young people disproportionately. Let me explain how. For example, 20 years ago, when many of us were entering the workforce, it was a known fact that as a young people, there were jobs for young people.
Yeah.
And those jobs, you would be waitressing, or you would be a barman, bar lady, or you would work in a retail store as a sales assistant or like a promo girl. There were jobs that were just known to be youth jobs. In the US, I think they even have young people who babysit children and stuff like that.
Or pairs.
But the reality is that as the job market becomes more competitive and more constrained, and you have pressure from those who are willing to work for less money, but may actually already be more experienced or maybe older or whatever, it squeezes the market. And so the first people to get squeezed out of that job market are very likely to be young people. And that's why you see overwhelmingly just younger people staying, which is good. They're a lot more qualified. They're staying in school for longer.
Yeah.
But the reality is that you then get a 28-year-old who has a master's degree, has been in varsity, has never worked, and has effectively lost a decade of potential work experience that their counterpart would have had 20 years ago. Now, I've digressed a bit, but I'm saying the what matters. And how I believe people, and young people too, not just young people, but people need to be, and so in South Africa we have a party political system, number one. In other words, as you know, parties contest for elections, we vote for parties, not people, and we have a proportional representation system. And the beauty of kind of what we now see is that it's no longer purely about having a majority. Even minority parties are able to actually have a say and have an outsized say in legislative matters and matters of how the country is governed. And we'll talk more about that, I assume, later. But as a starting point, I think you cannot want to be in the conversation and not want to be in the room. You can't.
Yeah.
You can't be shouting from outside the room. Respectfully, those who are showing up for a protest on the day the budget is being presented are about 7 months too late. Because the decisions around what is going to be part of the final presentation are made long before. And it's important to be part of that process or be part of the political conversation long before it ever gets to the point where the speech is being made. So I am still very much, and perhaps I'm biased, but I'm still very much a proponent of the fact that young people need to get involved in politics, in political organizing, political contestation, political party involvement, whichever party you choose. Whether it's Rise Mzansi or any other, I don't know, but you have to get involved. Sitting outside of where the action is does not guarantee that your voice will be heard.
Yeah.
And I have so much respect, of course, for civil society organizations, NPOs and otherwise that are doing the, let me call it, politically adjacent work and political influencing work. That is absolutely critical. But if you want to get your agenda platformed, if you want to get a piece of legislation tabled, there is one path and one path alone for that. It has to be put on the table by somebody who is carrying a mandate from the people who elected them. And I want to see more young people running and standing as candidates. We've got a local election coming now in 2026. I want to see more young people raising their hands to be candidates, whether they stand as independent candidates, which is challenging, but hey, go for it, or whether they stand under parties. But to do that, you've got to be willing to get stuck in and get involved in being part of an actual political formation in whichever way that works for you.
No, firstly, there's a lot that you've said to digest. One of the things really coming to the fore is nothing about us without us. But I wanted to really maybe try bridge the chasm that people have between public officials and the actual people that occupy the role, because I think you're uniquely placed to answer a few of these questions, because 2 years ago, you and MEC Vuyiswa Ramokgopa, you were a private citizen, Vuyiswa Ramokgopa, who we could see every day at our local spa, so now you're doing very important work for the state. But, you know, I wanted you to maybe break down the walls for a lot of our listeners, a lot of our viewers, because when they think of government and they think of government officials, they think of people who sit in fancy office talking about policy legislation that is completely devoid from the people. And they also view politics as something that is remotely different from what their basic needs are. That because the political class for so long has been occupied by people that are perceived for good or for bad, as people looking out for their own interests, there is nothing that we can tangibly hang on to, you know. Because we talk about political participation, I don't think many people realize that they can actually contact their member of parliament and get laws that they themselves write put on the parliamentary floor. It's called a private member's bill. I encourage some of our viewers to look it up. What has been the overwhelming thing that has struck you as soon as you entered the role as MEC? From private citizen to say, wow, a lot of my assumptions about how this thing worked are actually very different.
Well, where to start? Look, I mean, I think for the benefit of those who may not know my story, I mean, I started my career, like you say, in the private sector. I studied politics, economics, and philosophy, but I went into retail. And my first job actually was as a retail buyer for Edgar's, the Edcon Group. I worked for Edgar's, for Jet. I worked for private fashion labels. And I kind of spent the first 10 years of my working career as a retail fashion buyer. I then kind of dabbled a bit in marketing and events. I ran my own businesses. I used to run an events company and a number of other businesses. And then I veered into policy advocacy. So I headed up an organization called the South African Institute of Black Property Practitioners, which effectively which advocates for transformation in the property space. And so I spent a good 6-7 years building that organization and getting a lot closer to politics than I had been in the previous 10 to 15 years, because you're advocating for policy change. But what this really revealed for me was that, you know, after 7 years of fighting and raising the issues and writing the documents and attending the meetings and making representations in parliament, all we could do was actually influence. What is needed to make change is power. And there is a difference between power and influence. You know, you can influence, you can give the ideas, you can write the documents, you can lobby, but power is the person who says yes or no, who signs the document, who approves the policy, you know, and that rests, unfortunately or fortunately, in the political domain. And that's really what gave rise to gave rise to. That's what gave rise to the initial conversations about saying, okay, if indeed the problem is a political one, the only way to really solve that is to go and contest in the political space. And that's how we then formed Rise Mzansi with my other fellow Rise Mzansi leaders. But to come to your question, so then we contest an election, actually get elected. We have 2 seats in the National Assembly. We have 1 seat in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature. And it's quite massive, because at this point we had only been in existence formally for 18 months. But still managed to get quite a good showing, in that first election. And very shortly after the GNU was formed, I then became the MEC of Agriculture, occupying one of 10 cabinet positions in the Gauteng cabinet or Gauteng executive. And that's now how I find myself in government. So I'm coming into this space, completely green, having never, ever been in government, having never even transacted with government. I, like you say, stood on the other side, having my perceptions about what government is, why things do and don't work. And I think some of those perceptions are right, and I'll share what I think is indeed true. When we campaigned, we talked about, our campaign slogan was, "We need new leaders." And the theory there was that fundamentally there is a lack of leadership in the public sector, but also in the political sphere. And leadership is not just standing in front and singing the loudest, right? Leadership is all the things that come with leadership. It's vision, it's integrity, it's being able to hold people accountable, communicate that vision clearly to people so that they rally behind you, and ultimately to drive an organization or a country in a particular direction. That is why we are all so enamored and fascinated with the idea of leadership, because it is actually, in my opinion, the driving force of society. And not everyone can be leaders. Not everyone, I think, is cut out for it. But there is a fundamental lack of it. And so what I have come to see, actually being now in the public sector, and what has helped me now being in government, is to actually take that a step further and saying, what actually is the problem? Where does that issue lie? So indeed, on the one hand, it does lie in the political sphere. I mean, there's no doubt about that. When you are a member of cabinet, you sit as the executive authority, effectively having oversight responsibilities over the entire department. But where the rubber really hits the road is in the professional sphere of government, and that's really where you find the officials and the public officials, and these are like lifetime public servants. You know, these are not, technically speaking, supposed to be politically affiliated individuals, although we know how these things work. But technically speaking, you're supposed to have a separation between party and state, between the political and administrative interface, such that no matter what happens in the political arena, you still maintain that continuity and that backbone and structure of government, for however long. I mean, if you look at some of these European countries, like the Netherlands, which couldn't form a government, I think, for like 18 months or something. Germany was the same. But those countries don't grind to a halt. Because the political administration continues and is solid enough, has the institutional capacity to deliver, the skills, the resources, etc., etc. And I'm not saying those countries are perfect, but I'm making a bigger point. So what has really become clear for me is that the issues are multi-layered. And we have to deal with what I would call a massive organizational culture issue, which stems from, one, the prevailing political culture, and that you can't divorce the two. So if you look at the party that governs, like Rise Mzansi has a very different culture, for example, from the EFF or from the ANC. And I'm not saying anybody's is better, I'm just putting it out there that we do. So inevitably, what you bring as the political leadership has an impact culturally on the organization, being the department that you run. But similarly, you need to ensure that at an administrative level, you have the quality and caliber of leaders in the form of your DGs, or in our sense, you've got your HODs, your heads of department, and all the relevant management that sits in these departments have to be people themselves who are competent, who are qualified, and who are able to lead and drive an institution. And I think the unfortunate outcome of the last, 15, 20 years of erosion, let me say, of confidence and public trust is in the public sector, is that there has been an erosion of that culture. So the biggest shock not shock to my system, I kind of expected it, but it's different to see it, is just the differences, of course, between how the private and the public sector operate. I think the private sector is very outcomes driven, profit. You get measured on every sale, every rand, every minute. What are you doing, etc. The public sector is very different because, of course, the mandate is different. But that has an impact in terms of even how people operate, the performance culture, and how people and the accountability culture. In fact, in the public sector, there's a huge compliance focus. Compliance is like the most. It's the most coveted thing. If you can get a clean audit, and you get full marks on your APPs and all that, you've done well. Now, unfortunately, people can't eat clean audits. So you may have a clean audit, but the question is, have you actually delivered on your mandate as a department? And I think that aspect isn't often interrogated enough, whether the things that people need to comply to and the things that they're actually here to do are talking to each other. So it has been a big eye opener.
Yeah.
I must say I'm a lot more sympathetic, obviously, to those who are in the public sector. I've also come to know and see that there are so many really brilliant, really committed people in the public sector, many. And again, I think often they become victims of a culture and an organizational culture that doesn't value them, that doesn't seek to develop them to their fullest, and that doesn't recognize their efforts. And so people become demotivated and disconnected, and that has a massive effect across the board. I'm not even going to talk about issues of corruption and all of that. I mean, those things are known to all of us. But it's also about now starting to understand the character of corruption. Corruption is not just one man who lives in Nkandla.
It's a very direct picture of corruption.
I'm just saying, there is an oversimplification of how corruption manifests itself in our society and also in our institutions. It would be very myopic of us to imagine that corruption starts and ends in Nkandla. It doesn't. It's really, unfortunately, it's actually micro in nature. It is micro in nature. It's not always the big stories. It's not the things that make the headlines. It's the daily overpricing of basic goods. It's the fact that government will find itself paying 5 times, 10 times more for something than what you would buy that item for in the general private sector or general retail space. And that's the systemic corruption that I think I couldn't have imagined how, the scale of that. Some of it is nefarious, it's intentional, but some of it is also just by design. The system itself, in a way, necessitates that, because you have to work through a middleman. Somebody needs to put a quote, so obviously they need to put a margin on top, and so on and so forth. And so, as I'm saying, the picture for me has become a lot more nuanced. And when you're sitting on the outside, it's very easy to criticize, to throw stones, and we should continue to raise issues sharply. But I think from where I'm sitting, I have a better appreciation for why these issues exist, rather than just talking about the fact that they exist.
One of the things I also wanted to raise, since we have you here and we're talking about issues that are really at the heart of not just government, but at the heart of South African conversation. I'm going to ask you to brace yourself for this one. President Ramaphosa returned from the White House at the time of recording this last week, where he had a visit, meeting with US President Donald Trump. And quite a lot has been said post that meeting about whether or not it was a success or a failure. I feel that you specifically holding the portfolio in the Gauteng Provincial Executive of Agriculture and Rural Development, if I'm correct, you're better placed to, one, talk about this scourge of farm violence that is being purported and that was put pretty much center stage at the White House last week. But more than that, talk about the theory of white genocide and whether or not in South Africa, are we truly seeing a white genocide? Where is this coming from? Because you speak quite a lot to the farming community. You were at Nampop. I hope I said it correctly. Nampu. Yeah. Nampu. You were at Nampu the week before last, talking to the farming community there, seeing firsthand what their challenges are. Can you speak to, one, the narrative of farm violence, two, the purported scourge of a white genocide? I haven't seen it. I'm sure you haven't either, but we want to hear from you as someone who speaks directly with this community that is, quote unquote, being affected by it. But maybe thirdly, as a GPU partner, you could also talk about how you rate the president's performance. Did the president meet the moment, or did he fall short of giving South Africa its full vindication on the international stage?
Yeah, the big questions, but very important, very topical. And I think maybe let me start with the second question, actually. Yeah. It's the less annoying one. And I've seen a lot of talk of people rating the president's performance. And it's interesting also how you frame that question. For me, the question actually is, was that meeting successful in achieving what it sought to achieve? You know, I can do performance assessments on every single individual. Did they stand nicely? What did I think of the body language? I don't think that's what is the best use of our time. I think the question is, what did that meeting actually set out to do? And did the delegation that went to represent South Africa, one, did they understand what they were there to do? Did they respond accordingly to that moment? And did they achieve? And on balance, I think it is fair to say that that meeting was a success, and that on overall, they did achieve what they went there to achieve. And what was that they went to achieve? Sorry, I think that's me. And what was that? So, you know, the meeting, and I'll just put this out there, the meeting was not about white genocide.
Yes.
Let's just get that out the way. The meeting really is about addressing the prolonged and increasingly strained relations between South Africa and the US over the last few years. This actually predates even Trump's era. And it has been, we saw even with the Lady R situation, and there've been a number of different inflection points and moments in that have started to create a picture of, you know, how the relationship between the US and South Africa is shaping up. And what we have seen in the Trump era is actually a posture or a tone that effectively is saying, we're drawing a line in the sand, and we need to bring South Africa to the table to decide where they stand. I actually made an example earlier today, and I said, if we say it in dating terms, it's like South Africa and the US, you know, used to be going steady at some point, and everything was good, and everything was happy. And then South Africa started flirting with all these other countries and started like going on coffee dates with like Russia and China and all these other hands. And then, you know, the US was like, okay, cool, I'm down with that. We can maybe have a little bit of an open relationship. But then it started to seem like South Africa was spending more time with the side people rather than the main. And now we find ourselves here. And effectively, the US had to summon South Africa to say, come stand on TV and tell people that we're going steady.
Yeah.
You know, are we doing this? Yes or no? And so that meeting was really about resetting the relationship between the US and South Africa, and doing it in a way, yes, it was a bit of a humiliation ritual, but it was about saying, you know, the US wants to reassert its dominance as the leading global player, as the most important trade partner for South Africa. This is in effect, you know, a proxy for the issues that they're having with China, the issues that they're having in general with their own economic growth and their own, economic viability over time, given that, you know, so much of the manufacturing industry and whatever has been outsourced to China and other countries. And so South Africa plays a very strategic role, not just as a single country, but also regionally, you know, on the continent, etc. We have access to major trade routes, you know, the Simonstown kind of trade routes and stuff. So this was a very important public declaration that we are still with them.
Yeah.
And we are still aligned to the US and to the US's, and still invested in that relationship. And I think on that front, the trip was very successful. And on that front, I believe that the South African delegation, particularly Cyril Ramaphosa, rose to the occasion, because we did not go there to meet fire with fire. You don't do that.
Yeah.
You know, the truth is we had to be the adults in the room. And I believe that we were represented with great dignity, and with what I take to be a depth of understanding of negotiation 101.
Yeah.
I was saying, I saw you've got The Art of War there. You know, if you read The Art of War, they talk about that. They actually say when your enemy is progressing against you and is stronger than you, you must retreat strategically. There is a time to retreat strategically, and when the time is right, when you are strong, when you are capable, and when you are assured of a win, that is the time actually when you advance. So it would have been silly for us to try and meet fire with fire in that platform, in that moment. And I think those who are calling for that are not always seeing the situation in 3D. Mind you, like everybody else, like I'm South African, of course.
Yeah.
I wanted to see Ramaphosa, like, you know, turn the table over, storm out of there and tell Evil Musk that he's no longer going to let him back in the country. I would have wanted to see that.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the moment for that. And funny enough, you know, when that whole scenario, when that meeting was done, I said to myself, yeah, no, I think many of us are definitely not ready to be president.
Yeah.
Because, wow, I don't think I could have conducted myself with that level of restraint and decorum and just class. So I'll give it to him. So that is the one front. On the sort of the genocide issue, which is actually it's a red herring, quite frankly. We know, you know, Trump has been harping on about this since even his previous term.
2017, just about,
You know, he started going on about this. But it really, again, is the embodiment of what you see as this resurgence of right-wing, extremist, white supremacist politics that is emerging in all different quarters of the world. And unfortunately, as it turns out, one of South Africa's greatest exports is white supremacy and racism. And, you know, we've exported it to many parts of the world, and it's found its way to the US and to the discourse in the US. And this issue of white genocide has become that proxy, you know. In fact, even before the apartheid law became law in 1948, in fact, the policy that preceded that was what they called the poor whites policy.
Yeah.
And it was really about this idea that it's just an abomination that white people should experience poverty or should be disadvantaged by the structure of the economy in any way. And it gave impetus and rise to what would eventually become the apartheid policy. So I don't take these types of things lightly at all, because unfortunately, history has shown us that these types of narratives centering victimhood, and it's a weird kind of like, it's a victimhood that is actually founded in supremacy and supremacism, which is wild, right? But to center that is very dangerous. And for us to, and I don't think we must take it lightly or brush it off, despite the fact that I'm saying it's a non-issue. But I'm saying it is actually, it's a proxy for a bigger issue. And what we need to be alive to is what is happening all around us, and this mobilization of this conservative, right-wing, white supremacist kind of rhetoric that is now pervasive in the US, in South Africa, parts of Australia, parts of Europe. And it's not to be taken lightly. So, of course, statistically, this white genocide thing has been debunked over and over again. There's obviously no state-sponsored program of killing of white people, etc. I would even go so far as to argue that, you know, the argument that was put on the table by the team that crime is a problem. Yes, crime is a problem. But even if you get into the statistics of crime, I think we need to do more to actually understand the nature of crime in South Africa. Why are we the capital of violent crime? Let's start there. Let's not just, we just incidentally have crime. We have crime because we are a deeply traumatized a nation that has a lot of healing to do, both psychologically, but also in terms of structurally, socially, economically. No one wants to have those conversations. We're going to talk about crime as if it comes out of nowhere, you know. And so I'm saying these are the things. So we need to be, and I always say this, we need to focus on the issues. There's a quote from Toni Morrison that I always just remind myself of. Toni Morrison says, racism is a distraction. Racism is a distraction. And the full quote, she says something like, you know, they tell you your head is big, so you get busy proving that your head is not big. Then they tell you that your skin is this, and then you get busy proving that, no, we're not this. Or they tell you that you came from apes. Now you're busy proving that you didn't come from apes. But all the while, the systems and structures that uphold racism, that uphold inequality, that uphold social injustice and all of this, they stay in place. We get busy fighting with people on Twitter without dealing with the core issues. So I just, my appeal is that let's not allow ourselves to become distracted. There are a lot of things that are designed to distract us and keep us busy. We all know, we've dealt with the issue, we know there's no such thing as a white genocide, but what we really need to be asking ourselves is, what is actually happening around us, and what do we need to be doing to counter the bigger wave that is quite clearly forming around us? What type of politics do we need to be centering? What type of podcasts and voices do we need to be platforming? Because the guys who don't have our best interests at heart necessarily are getting millions of views a day. You know, so we have to be able to, I'd say, almost craft our own counter narrative, which obviously is coming from a different place.
Healing is a very interesting thing when it comes to South Africa, because I think it's something that's been written as we've been a healed country, and many people who are not from South Africa would tell you guys went through the TRC, you guys were liberated, Mandela Rainbow Nation, you guys came together, it was smiles, and it worked out. And I think now the question is that there's a move of anti-transformation that's becoming dominant within South Africa, particularly around the Bella Bill Act, particularly around potentially NHI, depending on how you view it as an issue, but also the Expropriation Act. And I think interestingly there is what's happening is that that's now starting to infiltrate into our politics. The question around who should we govern with, how should the people who are governing us look like, and very much still embedded in that personal political politics that's dominated South Africa for quite some time. And where we are now, particularly with the formation of the GNU, I guess my biggest question is, firstly, why did Rise decide to make that option when they could have made other options? Like, what was the justification around that? Because I think it's interesting hearing to how different parties saw the GNU. But secondly, now, being almost a year into it, we've passed a year of elections now.
Oh.
Yeah, 20 a year of elections, not a year of the GNU though.
Okay.
Within that, we've seen this anti-transformation point become very contentious. The ANC's been very big to say this is our means of forwarding transformation. And the DA's fought legally, they've fought in the political sphere, they've fought in the media space. And not to make it a DA-ANC conversation, because I think a lot of people forget that the GNU is a lot more than just those two parties. I still ask the question around, what does that then mean in terms of where South Africa's governance and politics is going? But also, what does that mean in terms of how you guys have viewed the GNU? Because there would be many who would say the ANC making this decision was historically anti-transformative. It's a regression on their policies. It's a regression on what's happened. And many of what the playouts have been in terms of the political sphere seem to affirm that to many people. But at the moment, it's very hard to necessarily figure out where parties lie and how we view the importance of transformation. But also within that, there's a massive recognition to say that healing hasn't occurred in South Africa, that actually pain has been silenced and that pain is resurging itself. So within that, how do you view the GNU as Rise? What was the choice going into that conversation? But secondly, what do you make of the GNU's developments, particularly around the budget and particularly around transformation as it stands?
Yeah, so I think there's a few critical questions in there. Let me start with why we made the decision to join the GNU, to be part of the GNU. You will obviously, as I had said earlier, you'll remember we got 2 seats in the National Assembly. We got 1 seat in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature. And we operate in a proportional representation system. So really the conversation was about where, even sort of as the GNU was shaping up, the conversation was, where is the best place for us to be able to, one, actually have impact and direct input to governance and governance decisions? And potentially, yes, that might be in the opposition space, but it's difficult to be an impactful opposition party with 1 seat.
Yeah.
Or with just 2 seats out of 400 in parliament. Not impossible, but difficult. You're not passing any votes, with 2 seats. So the question was, what was it that our voters, the people who voted for us, what did they want from us? What did we say to them, actually? We promised them, put a whole manifesto together. We had all these aspirations of things we wanted to do. We got the votes we got. Now, what is the best place and platform from which to be able to operate to deliver that to our voters and to the electorate? And our view was we would be more impactful and stronger within a GNU kind of formation than we would be trying to be a standalone party, trying to be an opposition voice with 2 seats outside of government. So when the opportunity arose, I mean, you'll know that our national leader, Mr. Zibi, is the chairperson of SCOPA, which is a very strategic role in Parliament, one that has effectively oversight responsibility on all departments, actually.
Yeah.
As well as institutions and state-owned entities. And that is a massively, it's a very powerful role if you use it effectively. And so, the opportunity to take that seat for us was really, really interesting and important. Again, because one of our key issues was about transparent, good governance, holding people accountable. But also, as you've now seen things really shaping up around the budget, the big conversations now is about effective use of public funds.
Yes.
It's one thing to say so-and-so didn't spend their budget, but even those that do spend their budget, do they do it to the benefit of the citizens? And we haven't had enough work done around whether we are spending effectively and how to build efficiencies into government. And so that role gives us an opportunity to do that. Similarly, in Gauteng, I think it goes without saying, being in the executive is a far, you have an ability to actually now implement the things that you said you wanted to do. And one of our core issues in the election was around ending hunger and fighting food insecurity. And we had a number of policy proposals, which we actually put into a dedicated paper on hunger. We're the only party in the whole of South Africa that campaigned on the issue of hunger and actually put a policy paper around that. And so this portfolio gave us a direct mandate to be able to now put some of those thoughts into action. So for us, it was a no-brainer. We don't want to just be making noise. We don't want to be professional noisemakers. We want to be people who are actually able to implement and effect change and drive the direction of the country. And I think this gives us an ability to do that. And mind you, even the work being done from our other Member of Parliament, Mr. Makashule Ghana, I mean, he has been exceptionally effective in raising issues around online gambling and the need to regulate online gambling, which, as we know, is a massive issue. And it's a silent killer that is tearing families apart, that is actually, I mean, it's one of the primary causes of suicide rates, even more than other, so-called social ills. So we've been able, I think, through the GNU to really be able to make an outsized impact. And I'm a firm believer in having a seat at the table. And I mean, this is why Rise Mzansi existed. I'm a firm believer in when there's a table and there's a chair there,
must be there.
You must sit in it. And then when you sit in it, don't sit and keep quiet. You must sit there and make your voice heard. And you must make sure that the people around the table listen to you. And I believe that that's what the GNU affords us. It affords us a seat at the table and an opportunity to be heard. And I'm personally, I'm very proud of the work that we've done in the last 12 months in our respective areas. So that's the one half. There's interesting arguments on both sides, and I think there's an important discussion we do need to have about transformation, about the original project of transformation, what it sought to achieve, where we now find ourselves as a country, and the policy instrument that we have used to try and effect the ideals of our constitution. I think it is actually unfair in a way to expect one single policy instrument called Black Economic Empowerment, which is one piece of legislation,
to change everything,
to bring to life and bring into effect everything that the Constitution promises. But to that end, a lot of people critique Black economic empowerment, saying it has not delivered on, for example, reducing inequality. It has not delivered on ensuring unemployment, or ensuring employment, rather, reducing unemployment. There are still millions of people living in informal settlements, waiting on housing lists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It hasn't given us better access to finance to start up new businesses. It has not ended racism either in our society. So, I think we must measure it fairly and be able to critique it equally and say what Black economic empowerment has done. And there's a lot of good things that it's done. We have had the fastest growing middle class of, I think of the last 20 to 30 years of many developing countries. We've built a solid middle class. We have built in many industries like your accounting industry, engineering, and other professional sectors. You now have a critical mass of Black professionals represented in those industries because the policy instrument created somewhat of an incentive to actually invest in these people. So that is a fact. You have transformation at a managerial level in companies where you have vastly different profiles of board members, senior managers, etc., and even in middle management and lower structures in the public and the private sector. So from that front, we can't throw it out and say it has been wholly ineffective. But of course, we must also be willing to give a balanced critique to say in many ways, yes, it has also not, it hasn't succeeded. We still have townships. We are still talking about township development today. We are failing to create like solid black enterprises and build a proper industrial class that is driven by black people. We're not driving innovation and black-led innovation. We have countries on the continent like Kenya that are outpacing us in technology. You know, and so I think there's a fair critique that must be made. Now, our sense is that this is a journey. And I think the problem is that there's often a false dichotomy. It's like you must either throw away the whole thing or you love the whole thing. You are either, if you don't love the whole thing, then you are anti-black and you have full of self-hate. If you then you want the thing, then you are corrupt and you want to eat with all the corrupt politicians.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
And there's not enough proper analysis, in my opinion, that is done about the successes and failures. They exist. I worked, by the way, in this space. In my previous role, as I said, I worked in this space. I wrote, and I contributed to actually writing the property sector codes that sit within the BE sector code of the property sector today. I wrote policies for departments, you know, empowerment policies that were never implemented. So it's a multi-pronged issue. I think what is a more important conversation to be had, and this is what's not happening enough, I think, is the conversation that says, what is the nature of development that needs to happen in South Africa? What do we need? What needs to happen? If you were to ask me today, if you were to give me a magic wand, or you were to give me Donald Trump's executive powers to sign everything and make things happen, what would I do? I would say the single biggest, I'd say probably the three biggest issues we have to focus on and we have to be completely uncompromising about is job creation. I think it's the single biggest threat to our national security, to our viability as a country, to our political project, to our democracy. Unemployment is going to be a massive threat, and the growing unemployment rate. So if you center that metric and you say the metric for success is seeing job growth, what does that require us to do? What it requires us to do is have a certain type of development, of course. It requires you to focus on labor-intensive industries. It requires you to focus perhaps even on export-driven growth. It requires you to focus on spatial inclusion and how you bring job opportunities closer to where the workforce is so that you can reduce the cost of that employment. It forces policies to center around a very specific single objective. The objective of 30 years ago was we want to see more black faces in the room. Have we done that? Of course. Tick, we've done that.
Yeah.
But I believe that the objective of the next 30 years needs to be how do we become a thriving, prosperous economy? And the foundational base of that is to say we have to be driven by industry, innovation, technology if we want to create jobs at the scale and level that we need to. We have to look at some of this, call it structural exclusion issues, you know. Why do we have so many people who are still unbanked? What impacts the ability for people to access credit? It is a proven fact that access to credit is one of the biggest catalytic, one of the biggest catalyzers of economic development.
Yeah.
Increasing the ability for people to access credit in an economy. And then we need to look at also just the region. You know, the region, and when I talk about exports, I'm not just talking about exporting to China and others, but our relationship with our regional partners and saying, where do we need to position South Africa to be able to benefit, if not drive, whatever growth is coming out of the region? Because we are performing below many of our regional counterparts. I mean, these are countries that are, many of them are coming from a lower base. But if you look at places like Addis Ababa today versus what it was 15 years ago, you know, South Africa is largely the same as what it was. Addis is like a completely different place. You know, Nairobi is a completely different place. Still a lot of work to be done. Still a lot of challenges. But if they sustain that same level of growth for the next 15 years, and we stay where we are definitely going to be outpaced and we're going to be left behind. So that for me, and I'm not skirting your issue of transformation, but I'm saying for me, the conversation about whether we need to get more black faces in the room, whether we've got enough black faces in the room, do we have a woman CEO here or a black CEO there, that for me is a somewhat
trivial almost.
It's a limited perspective on the conversation. How do we create an economy that is growing, is inclusive, of course, that creates space and accommodates, well, that doesn't discriminate, rather, on the basis of age or race or your address or whether you have a car or not. I mean, these are the things we need to be asking ourselves. And poverty, of course, we know, exists at all levels. And wealth, extreme wealth, we skirt the issue of inequality like nobody's business. We talk about it. We don't internalize it. The truth of the matter is that we have black people, the highest inequalities experienced amongst the black population, because that's where we have the lows and the highs. So if you're going to put forward legislation that addresses issues of inequality, you best know it's going to affect black people too. And being black in and of itself is not an economic it's not an economic status, by the way. And so I think it does start with that. But then, just as a parting shot, the other element which we haven't done enough work on, and you touched on this when you talked about the pain and the trauma that we're still all collectively experiencing. But what we have not done enough work on as a country is the questions of nation building, like real nation building. I'm not talking about, when the Springboks wins and we're all happy with each other for like 12 minutes. I'm talking about the real stuff. I'm saying confronting the question of what do we need to become a nation? Real questions. For example, do we need to is there still a place in society for racial categorization? I'm talking about officially. Why is it that in 2025 you're still filling out a form that asks you whether you're white, black, colored, Indian, other? Are we not ourselves just reinforcing and re-entrenching the, apartheid organization of society? We have not done any work to say, how do we actually want to be classified as a people that are part of a nation? We are comfortably grouped perhaps in our ethnic groups, our language groups, etc. But here we all are speaking English to each other, right? Because that's our common ground. So the question again is, have we done that work to say, why don't we even have a common language that we speak amongst each other? Is there no room for that? Is there no room to have that discussion, to say, could there not be a place where we find each other in the middle? And the fact that you have young, whether it's white kids or kids born of non-African descent, who till this day don't speak a single African language, can't understand a single African language, says to me, we haven't done that work adequately, So I think we, in spending our time in this perpetual loop of trivialities and having leaders who are too old, too rich, too fat, too unimaginative to conceive of a different future, we are not doing that work, which is really critical work. And I'm hoping it's the kind of work that young, leaders like yourselves are actually going to concern yourself with. The work of reimagining what South Africa should be, what it should look like. Should it even be called South Africa? Are we happy with that name? Who's asking these questions, right? So there's going to be a national dialogue, I know, that will be held very soon. And I'm hoping that, and I'm not optimistic, but I'm hoping that some of the discussions need to also center on some of these quote-unquote softer issues. It's not always just about which law, which piece of, because the law is the outcome of the will of the people, which is the politics must drive that ultimately, and we must do the work of saying, what is the kind of country we want our children to grow up in 30 years from now? I can assure you, I don't want my children growing up in the kind of South Africa that we have today, where crime is at the levels that it's at, where social disunity is at the level that it's at, where they don't have economic opportunities, where they are likely to finish, have a degree, and never get a job. That is not the kind of place I want to raise my children in. And I think we must be deliberate about reimagining a very different future.
Yeah. I want to say thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your time, your knowledge, and information. This has been insightful in more ways than one for me. And thank you for what you guys are doing at Rise. I think it's underestimated being a new party doing so well. I don't think we appreciate just that step in and of itself, considering from 200 parties, you got 2 seats. That's a massive feat. And to everyone else out there in Born Free, I want to say Happy Youth Month to you. Of course, we're going to be having serious conversations. We're going to be talking about the things. We're going to be asking the serious questions. And as always, we hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you.